Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Criminal Investigations taught completely in an online format. This is Chapter 1, Part 3, right? Okay, so just for clarity's sake, once again, I'm in the 11th edition, and we ended off Part 2 over on page 13 talking about investigators who were culturally adroit. And let's take a look on 13. It says, investigators also develop knowledge of and skill of investigative techniques, such as interviewing and interrogating. Remember, we interview witnesses, we interrogate suspects, right? Photographing and sketching, searching and note-taking, and numerous other areas discussed in Section 2. Then go down to the next paragraph, and right in the middle it says, logic is indispensable and often involves reverse thinking. That is, working the case backward. Why did an event happen, right? And then there's a little discussion of decision-making in the next paragraph. It says, decision-making is continual, and to be effective must be based on facts. When investigators review information and evidence, they concentrate on what is known, meaning facts, rather than on what is only probable. And they eliminate personal opinions as much as possible. With sufficient facts, investigators can make valid inferences from which they can logically draw definite conclusions. Okay, so just want to make sure we understand these words. So, and I actually talked about it a little bit, I think, in the last part. But just remember something. An inference is a conclusion that you come to that is supported by the facts. And if you remember the example of the drunk driver, you remember what I'm talking about, the inference, the conclusion was they were intoxicated. How did you come to that conclusion? Well, the fact that they smelled like alcohol, their speech was slurred, their eyes were bloodshot, and they were unsteady on their feet, right? So, without further ado, let's get down to the bottom of 13, and there's some definitions of facts, opinions, and inferences. It says a fact is an action, an event, a circumstance, or an actual thing done. In contrast, an inference is a process of reasoning by which a fact may be deduced, known as deductive reasoning. We talked about this already. It says an opinion is a personal belief, right? And then it gives us an example of an investigator called to the scene of a shooting and finds a dead man with a revolver in his hand, which is a fact, and a suicide note on the table, which is another fact. The officer might infer that the man committed suicide, right? Because he's coming to a conclusion supported by the facts. But they may also hold the opinion, and they might have an opinion about people who commit suicide. So you see the difference between facts, opinions, and inferences, right? And they go on to mention on page 14 inductive reasoning, right? Now, inductive reasoning sounds different than deductive reasoning, and it is, right? So whereas deductive reasoning was coming to a conclusion supported by the facts, inductive reasoning is going from the generalization and establishing it by gathering specific facts. What does that mean? Well, in many, many circles, when you talk about an investigator using inductive reasoning, you're talking about an investigator who probably came to a conclusion first and then tried to just gather facts to support his or her conclusion without caring for any evidence that may have disputed their conclusion. So you can see how inductive reasoning is a problem. And on 14, the second paragraph on the left side says, although investigators must draw inferences and form theories, they must also remain open-minded and willing to consider alternatives. Effective investigators guard against the tendency to become sold on a suspect or theory early in an investigation because such a mindset creates an investigative myopia or short-sightedness, fostering the subconscious shaping of evidence or interpreting information to support their premature theory. Preconceived ideas hinder good investigations. Objectivity is essential. Whenever an inference is drawn, its validity should be tested by examining the facts on which it is based. So a couple of things here. The term myopic is in there, or myopia, right? And that essentially means, being short-sighted, looking at life through a paper towel tube, not having any peripheral vision, not seeing the big picture. And they also talk about objectivity. And remember, there's objectivity and there's subjectivity. Subjectivity means you are influenced by your opinion and your biases. And a good way to remember that is subject to your opinion. All right? And then objectivity is you are influenced by the facts. You're driven by the facts. So when it comes right down to it, do we want our investigators to be objective or subjective? We want them to be objective for sure, right? Let's take a look at the next paragraph. It says, the investigator seeks the truth, not simply proof of the suspect's guilt. And then they go on to talk about Article 10 of the Canons of Police Ethics from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And it says, the law enforcement officer shall be concerned equally in the prosecution of the wrongdoer and the defense of the innocent. He shall ascertain what constitutes evidence and shall present such evidence impartially and without malice. Yes, that's that whole thing. My definition of the goal of every criminal investigation. What is it? The goal of every criminal investigation is to uncover the truth, whatever it might be, and to deliver that truth with integrity. And don't forget the difference between inculpatory and exculpatory evidence. Investigators have to be concerned with both. You know, there was a famous case of a United States senator. His name was Ted Williams, and he was convicted of corruption charges. He was from Alaska, I think. He was convicted of corruption charges. He was thrown out of the Senate and basically died a disgraced, older man. And after his death, an FBI agent came forward and said that the prosecutor had ignored exculpatory evidence in the case that would have exonerated him, right? And it was amazing because then the case was re-examined, and sure enough, it was determined that the prosecutor withheld exculpatory evidence, and the prosecutor was disbarred. That means not allowed to practice law anymore. But Senator Ted Stevens was dead and gone, and he had been maligned. He'd been thrown out of the Senate. He'd been convicted. You know, it was a sad case of exculpatory evidence gone unheard, right? So an investigator has the obligation to cherish and safeguard both of those types of evidences, inculpatory as well as exculpatory, because you're looking for the truth. You're looking for the truth. Let's go down to psychological characteristics of investigators. At the bottom of page 14, our learning outcome 4, it says effective investigators are emotionally well-balanced, detached, inquisitive, suspecting, discerning, self-disciplined, conscientious, and persevering. Yeah, they're all of those things, right? And on the bottom right-hand side of page 14, the last paragraph says, perseverance, coupled with inquisitiveness and intuition, is indispensable in difficult cases. Scores of experienced investigators attest to the value of intuition, that is, a sudden knowing without conscious reasoning or apparent logic. Based on knowledge and experience, intuition is commonly referred to as street sense. It is the urge to proceed with no apparent valid reason, a gut feeling developed through experience. And that gut feeling is a term that I often use to describe intuition. It's like, you kind of, based on your training and your experience, you have this feeling in your gut, but you really can't explain it, right? Let's go up to physical characteristics, right? And it says, learning outcome 4 in the blue box, it says, effective investigators are physically fit, have good vision and hearing. Undercover investigators must also look the part. Yep, that's true, right? And I have a little note in my book here of the CSI effect, and I'm not sure if we discussed it already, but I want to introduce it at this point. So what is it? We all know what CSI is, right? It's that hugely popular television show. And so what is the CSI effect? Well, basically, the CSI effect is unrealistic expectations regarding the mechanics of criminal investigations based largely on misinformation provided by television. What does that mean? Well, a bunch of surveys were done of people sitting on juries, and it discovered that many of these people wanted like forensic evidence all the time. They wanted ballistic evidence all the time, even if there wasn't any in the case. They wanted fingerprints in every case, or they wanted DNA. And that's all part of the CSI effect. Again, it's that unrealistic expectations on the part of people who aren't in criminal investigations about the mechanics of investigation based largely on misinformation presented on television. You know, on TV, you see it all the time. They accomplish, a year's worth of work in 30 seconds, and it's an unrealistic expectation. Or they get a toxicological report back from the medical examination and from the medical examiner in an hour. That's completely unrealistic. So make sure you understand the CSI effect. So that being said, let's go over to an overview of the investigative process on the top of page 15. And actually, I'm reading the last sentence in the paragraph on the right-hand side. It says, it is important for the student to recognize that written reports are involved in every stage of the investigative process and report writing consumes a substantial amount of investigators' time. That is completely true, and so as I say to all my students, make sure you work on your writing skills. It'll be critically important to your success. And if you're in law enforcement, and I don't care what branch, corrections, probation, parole, court officers, cops, whatever it is, you're going to be asked to write, and so you have to write fairly well. So you need to work on that, right? Let's go over to page 16, the initial investigation and police contact. And it talks about the initial response, but a concept that I want you to get definitively is this. The initial responding officers always do preliminary investigations. That's the first investigation done usually by the cops on patrol, the first responders, right? But all serious crimes require a follow-up investigation. That means a second attempt at investigating this crime so that you go over all of the steps of the preliminary, make sure everything was caught, make sure everything was done properly, what did we miss, et cetera, et cetera. All serious crimes require a follow-up, right? So let's talk about the initial response, right? And before we begin, I want to say something about when a cop gets to an emergency. This is for our purposes in this text. So when police get to the scene of an emergency, right, here's the list of priorities. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of the book, but there's a reason for method to my madness here. When they get there, if there's an emergency, right, like let's say an active shooter, then you have to clear the crime scene, right? That means you have to make it safe. That means you have to neutralize any threats. And then after clearing the crime scene, neutralizing any threats, right? Then, and that means handling emergencies, by the way, right? You get to the scene, there's somebody shooting, that's the emergency at hand. There could be people lying there shot, but you can't stop to take care of them if someone is shooting, right? You have to neutralize that threat first, right? But after you neutralize the threat, you have to turn your attention to anybody who might be injured. And then that becomes the priority. And then after that, we do what's called secure the crime scene. And that's when you worry about the crime scene condition. You don't worry about the crime scene condition first and then worry about the shooter and then the people who are lying there. No, you take care of the active emergency first. Then you take care of any people who need medical aid, and then you secure the crime scene, all right? So make sure the distinction between clearing the crime scene, which really means making it safe and neutralizing any threats and handling the emergencies, and securing it, which is after everything is of importance is really done. That's the next most important thing. So on the right-hand side of 16, it says there's like 6 bullet points. It says it is important to arrive at a crime scene rapidly, and I say, but safely, right? Because if you don't get there safely, you're not going to help anyone. Because, and then there's 6 bullet points. The suspect may still be at the scene or near the scene. Injured persons may need care. Witnesses may still be there. A dying person may have a confession or other pertinent information to give. We call that, by the way, a dying declaration. When a person believes they're going to die and they tell you something truthfully, that's called a dying declaration. It is a form of hearsay, and dying declarations are often allowed into testimony, unlike other forms of hearsay, which often are not allowed in. Because in hearsay, you're testifying to what someone else said as a matter of truth. And if the person believed they were dying and they said something to you, and the judge believes they believe they were dying, then they're going to allow a dying declaration to be testified to in a court, and that's an exception to the hearsay rule. And then the next bullet says whether conditions may change or destroy evidence. Yes, that's true. I mean, think about a homicide on a rainy night on a street. That's tough, right, to keep the evidence intact. And then it says the integrity of the crime scene and evidence must be preserved. Absolutely. Let's look at the paragraph right below it. It says the responding officers proceed to the scene as quickly as safety allows. Officers who injure themselves or someone else on the way to a call may create more serious problems than exist at the crime scene. They may, in fact, open themselves, their department, and even their city to civil and criminal liability. Sure, right, getting sued for police accidents and things like that. Yeah, you got to arrive there safely. So whenever I see police driving recklessly, it drives me crazy, right? All right, let's go over to page 17. And on the left-hand side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs down, it starts off, many departments have found that sending several vehicles to a crime scene may not be the most effective approach. Instead, they implement a bullseye or targeted approach, dispatching only a few vehicles directly to the crime scene, which is the bullseye. Yeah, this is true. Depending on the crime and depending on the method of flight from the bad guys, a lot of times you'll dispatch a bullseye kind of response, because what you want is only a couple of units to go into the middle of the crime scene, but you want other units to stay around, right? They're on the outer edges. And what are they doing? Well, they're there. They're waiting for the description of the perpetrator. They're trying to find out what's going on. And because the belief often is that the perpetrator might have been gone already by the time those units get into the nucleus of the crime scene. And so to have some other units on the outskirts, they might be there to catch the bad guy, right? And let's take a look at the point of arrival at the bottom of page 17. It says, when the first officers arrive, the scene may be either utter chaos or deserted. Regardless of the situation, the officers must take charge immediately and form a plan for proceeding based on the information that they have at hand, which might not be much. The actions of the first responders at a crime scene can determine the value of the evidence for investigators and prosecutors. Yeah, when you get to a crime scene and you get there and the crime has already happened, which is, vast majority of the times, that's the deal, right? It's already over. You have to find out what's going on. You have to get the description out of the bad guys. You got to make sure people are, taken care of. And again, go, on that note, go over to 17 on the right-hand side. It says setting priorities. It says circumstances at the scene often dictate what is done first. I crossed out often in my book, and I wrote circumstances at the scene always dictate what's done first. Of course, it's what's going on at the scene which is going to tell you or let you know how to proceed. And then learning outcome 5, super important. The priorities when arriving at a scene of a crime are handle emergencies first to achieve scene safety. That basically means neutralizing any threats that might be there, right? That's an emergency. And then second, it says secure the scene to protect the integrity of the investigation. Well, really, what that means is that in the number 1, in handle emergencies, you've already rendered aid to people, right? And then the third one says investigate. Let me clear this up, and don't get confused. Listen to me. You arrive at the scene. Priority number 1, handle emergencies, right? Neutralize any threats. Number 2, render aid to any victims that need it. Number 3, secure the crime scene and investigate. That's the answer. That is the answer. That's what I want you to know. You don't come up to the scene of a shooting and the bad guy's running down the street and the person's laying there bleeding out and you say, you know what, I got to chase you after this bad guy. I'll be right back to take care of you. No. That guy running away, he's not an emergency. He's running away. You have to take care of the person who's DOA or is about to die on your hands at the crime scene. So what do? Number 1, we handle emergencies first. We neutralize any threats. Number 2, we render first aid. Number 3, secure the crime scene and investigate, right? Okay, let's take a look at the bottom of 17. It says sometimes emergencies dictate procedure. Again, it's not sometimes, it's always, right? Emergencies always dictate procedure. An emergency may include a dangerous suspect at or near the scene, a gravely injured person, or an environmental hazard such as a downed power line or chemical spills. Any of these emergencies can present a life-threatening situation for the officer and others, and their handling takes priority over other actions and situations. For example, if you arrive at the scene of a crime and the suspect begins to shoot at you, apprehending him becomes your first suspect because you want to neutralize the threat. But in other instances, a person may be so seriously injured that without immediate aid, death is probable. So as soon as there's no more threat to you, then you have to render first aid. Such an emergency takes precedence over all other procedures unless officer safety or other public safety concerns preclude it. The scene must be cleared and then secured. The scene must be, the book says secured, and I cross it out. The scene must be cleared before an officer administers aid. Yeah, you have to make sure there's no existing threat. The guy's not still, the bad guy's not there, the shooter's not there, etc. Right, and then you render your aid. Right. Let's flip the page, page 18, and learning outcome 5 down the bottom in the blue box. It says any suspect at the scene should be detained, questioned, then released or arrested depending on the circumstances. And then I have in big letters, but make sure you document that entire interaction, right? You stop somebody, you question them, anything like that should be documented. And then it says if the suspect has recently fled, right, over on the right-hand side of page 18. And of course, we want to get descriptions out. We want to understand or find out where their whereabouts might be and put it over the radio. Let the other cops who are out there looking for this guy or girl, let them look, right? So that's that. Go over to, environmental hazards. Protecting the crime scene on page 19, right? This is a good point here. Securing the crime scene is a major responsibility of the first officers to arrive. Everything of a non-emergency nature is delayed until the crime scene is protected. That's non-emergency. The critical importance of securing the crime scene is better understood when one considers Locard's principle of exchange and Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, and you scar what you explore, a basic forensic theory that postulates that when objects come into contact with one another, there was always a transfer of material, however minute, between them. This evidence can easily be lost if the crime scene goes unprotected. At outdoor crime scenes, weather conditions such as heat, wind, rain, snow, or sleet can alter or destroy evidence. In addition, people may accidentally or intentionally disturb the scene, like EMS workers who are trying to help somebody. They may make a mess. There's nothing you can do about it, right? They're doing their job. They're helping someone. They may leave behind, garbage from their gauze pads and their tape and all that stuff. It is what it is. You know what I mean? Additions to the scene can be as disconcerting to later investigation as the removal of evidence is. Yeah, don't tamper with the scene. Page 19 on the right side. Crime scene protection can be as simple as locking a room or a door to a building, or it can involve roping off large areas outdoors. Within a room, chairs or boxes can be used to cordon off, or you can use that great tape, crime scene, do not enter. And then two paragraphs down, it says, sometimes other officers arriving at the scene can cause problems by ignoring posted warnings and barriers. Ironically, police officers with no assigned responsibilities at a crime scene are often the worst offenders. Yes, and that's when the boss has to say to them, you don't belong here. Go outside the tape. And believe me, as a sergeant, lieutenant, captain on the NYPD, I did that many, many times. Ask people why they're there. Why are you here? Yeah, no, we don't need you. Outside the tape. All right. Remember, we're trying to keep the crime scene as pristine as we can. We don't need people who aren't necessary. I had a triple homicide one time, the chief wanted to come up just to walk around the crime scene and take a look, and we were really, really scared that we had to keep this crime scene pristine so we could get everything we could out of it. And I basically talked to the chief, and actually I didn't talk to the chief. I talked to his driver, see if I could keep him out of the crime scene, and we were successful. The chief wouldn't have probably taken it too kindly. All right, let's go to conducting the preliminary on page 20. Remember the difference between interrogation and an interview. And let's go down to learning outcome 5. It says responsibilities during the preliminary investigation include questioning victims, witnesses, and suspects. Yes, we interview victims and witnesses. We interrogate suspects. It says conducting a neighborhood canvass. Canvass is an old school term, still a basic building block of good police work. What does a canvass mean? You go from door to door, soliciting information, trying to find people who might have seen something, talking to neighbors, friends, potential witnesses, etc. That's a canvass. Then it says measuring, photographing, videotaping, and sketching the scene, searching for evidence, identifying, collecting, examining, and processing physical evidence, and recording all statements and observations and notes. I would like to introduce a term to you right here called evidence recognition skills, right? Evidence recognition skills is the ability to recognize that something has evidentiary value. And basically the rule is this: the more inexperienced you are and the less training you are, the lower your level of evidence recognition skills are. As you become more and more experienced and more well-trained, your evidence recognition skills increase. Let's go down to the bottom of page 20. It says information may be volunteered by victims, witnesses, or suspects at or very near to the time of the criminal action. Unplanned, spontaneous statements about what happened by people present at the scene are called res gestae. Res gestae statements are unrehearsed statements made at the time of a crime concerning and closely related to the actions involved in the crime. They are often considered more reliable and truthful than later planned responsible statements. Res geste statements are generally an exception to the hearsay rule because they are usually very closely related to facts and therefore admissible in court, right? Let's just talk about this for a second. You roll up to the scene of a crime. There's a guy there, and he's standing over a body. You walk up, and he looks at you, and he says, "I hope I killed him." That's res geste. That's a spontaneous statement, not in response to any question of yours. The person just blurted it out. You record it. It is, if you testify to it later as truth, it is hearsay, of course, because you're testifying to what someone else said is truth. But res geste, like dying declarations that we talked about a few minutes ago, are often exceptions to the hearsay rule, and they are often allowed into court testimony. Below that, and remember, when it comes to Miranda warnings, right, you have the right to remain silent, all those things. Here's a simple formula, Cacciatore formula. When someone's in custody, plus you're going to question them, they must be given Miranda. So I usually put on the blackboard when I'm teaching, custody plus questioning equals Miranda. If they're not in custody and you're not going to question them, no Miranda. If they're in custody and you have no intention of questioning them, do you have to give them Miranda? Probably not, because you're not going to ask them anything that might be incriminating, right? And what kind of case would that be? Well, there are lots of them. You roll up to the scene of a crime and, 40 people point out the shooter and you grab him and he's got the gun in his hand and 40 people say that's the guy that shot him. I mean, you might. It's unusual not to interrogate someone in that circumstance, but you might. But what's my point? Custody plus questioning equals Miranda. Custody plus questioning. And then there's a discussion on the bottom of page 20 about field testing. You know what that is, right? Police pull over a car. They think the guy has marijuana. They don't know for sure. They take out a little chemical kit and they field test the substance. And it says it's marijuana. They lock him up. Keep in mind something. Field tests create probable cause for officers to act. They are insufficient in the state of New York to get a conviction. In order to get a conviction, you have to have a certified criminal lab say that substance was whatever it was, marijuana, amphetamines, cocaine, heroin, whatever it was. But a field test gives probable cause. But for a conviction in New York, we need a lab test, right? And let's flip the page. A whole bunch of stuff there about, I think, dealing with the press and stuff like that. Let's go over to page 23, Learning Outcome 6. You see it right there. It says, case screening involves the systematic evaluation of solvability factors, such as the existence of witnesses and physical evidence, to determine which cases have the greatest likelihood of being solved, and thus which should be assigned for further investigation. What they're really talking about here is when you get a case, investigators and their bosses, by the way, often determine how solvable is this case. Is this case going to be unsolved? I mean, we just have this idea. There's no forensic evidence. There's no physical evidence. There's no DNA. There's no nothing. There's no witnesses. You could have a case like that. So solvability is something that you try to measure at every step of the way, because then it tells you how far you should go, how many resources you should allot to it, etc. That fact and myth box on page 23, the myth says, the vast majority of crime scenes contain forensic evidence that can definitively link a suspect to the scene. That's the myth. The fact is, very few reported crime incidents, 2% of all cases, and 6% of all cases with crime scene evidence, and 12% of all cases with examined evidence, have forensic evidence that links a suspect to the crime scene. That's the CSI effect. We think that every single crime scene is going to yield evidence that's going to definitively link a suspect to the crime scene. That's just not true. Robbery is a great example. Robbery is a crime that happens very, very quickly, and there is often little exchange between the bad guy and the victim. So, it's not like, let's say, a sex crime where there's a lot of exchange, and sometimes we get trace evidence, we get hair, we get fiber, we get even serological evidence, we get semen, we get blood sometimes, things like that. That's different. But there are lots and lots of crimes where you're not going to get any forensic evidence, but yet people think we are, and that's a classic example of the CSI effect. Okay, let's go over to page 24, and it talks about the follow-up investigation. Remember what I said to you. All serious crimes require a follow-up investigation. It is not sufficient to just do the preliminary. So reading from the text, it says, preliminary investigations that satisfy all the investigative criteria do not necessarily yield enough information to prosecute a case. Despite a thorough preliminary investigation, many cases require a follow-up investigation. A need for a follow-up investigation doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on those who conducted the preliminary. Of course not. The information might not have been there. They might not have had time to, do a thorough canvass, a big canvass. So it's not a reflection on the people who did the preliminary, right? So remember, it's super important to get that follow-up in on serious crimes. And then there's a conversation about computer-aided investigation on 24. I want you to know this word, a query, Q-U-E-R-Y, Q-U-E-R-Y. A query is when you ask a database a question, right? You put a question into a database, and it spits out an answer. The question is called a query. And then there's a term, data mining. Data mining is sifting through large amounts of data looking for something that pertains to your case. So if you have a partial license plate and you have to go through 1,000 plate numbers to kind of figure out what 10 cars might be involved in your crime, that's data mining. And then you have the word paradigm in that paragraph. A paradigm is a model or a way of doing something, right? So this paragraph, computer-aided investigation, starts talking about 1994, William Bratton in New York City. I worked for him, by the way, during that time period, directly. But what are they talking about? They're talking about how computers forever changed criminal investigations, and they absolutely positively did, because the ability to share information not only among people in the same department, right, in the same jurisdiction, but the ability to share information among other agencies, other jurisdictions, just exploded with the use of computers. And so I think I'm going to end it there, and we'll come back at the bottom of page 24 with that paragraph, the ability to share data, and we'll have the discussion there. And so once again, make sure you're taking good notes during these lectures, just like you're sitting in the classroom. You follow me? That's how you're going to get through. You study your notes heavily before you take the exams. I even recommend that people sometimes listen to the lectures right before they take the exams. That could help too. All right. So I guess that's it, right? The end of part 3. We're going to part 4, which is pretty rare, by the way. So, as always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the blog.